Found the button. Okay, found the button. Zoom keeps hiding it. And slideshow, I'm going to, let's see if I hit from beginning. There we go. You guys can see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, I'm gonna let people in. You guys all set?
I am.
All right, I'm gonna let them in. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll just wait a couple of minutes and let a few more people trickle in, and then we'll be getting started. All right, I am going to just mute all the participants. If you have a question you want to ask and want to unmute, please feel free to do so. Just try to remove any background noise before we get started. If this is the first kind of webinar you've come to that we've hosted, we are very, collaborative and want this to be a conversation. So please, by all means, feel free to post questions in the chat, unmute and ask questions. Obviously, the benefit of this is for you. So we really want to make sure that you leave here feeling as informed about this topic as you can. So don't hesitate. There's no such thing as a bad question when it comes to, especially a topic like this that is pretty technical and not so self-explanatory. So don't hesitate at all. I'm just going to tee us up, and then I'm going to hand it over to our guests in just a few moments. But for anybody who's not familiar with the company, we are Paragus IT. We're an employee-owned managed service provider in Western and Central Massachusetts. We serve about 150 organizations, ranging from as small as 10 or 15 employees up to about 1,000 employees. And we are about 65 full-time employee owners across our two offices, one in Hadley, Massachusetts, and one in downtown Worcester, Massachusetts. Our core purpose, as we always like to say, is this idea of making IT fun. And that's really at the core and the heart of these webinars. The reason we take the time to put these on and hopefully provide value to you is to simplify things that can sometimes be intimidating or complicated. And it's in that spirit of kind of making IT fun, which for us means making it accessible, making it understandable, and leveraging IT as a way to enhance, protect, grow your business. And so this is an important topic, but it's one that sometimes is a little bit mystified. And our goal today is to demystify it. And we've got some amazing resources joining us today who are going to help us accomplish that goal. Our company is broken into 4 departments. We have our on-demand support, our security and compliance, our strategic planning services, and our business automation team. And then, of course, our foundation, which is our projects department, who helps clients implement the technologies that they need to be successful. So let me just give you a little bit of context of why you're here and why we chose this particular topic. Pen testing or penetration testing is a term that you hear thrown around a lot. You'll hear it thrown around by security experts, by insurance companies, by customers, by vendors. And a lot of times businesses will ask you, have you done a penetration test? When's the last time you performed a penetration test or a pen test? And the problem with that question is it's incredibly vague and nonspecific, and it really can be very misleading. Penetration testing can be almost similar to the idea that we think about like cloud computing. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. There is no one singular definition that totally represents it that's universally shared. And so sometimes I think organizations mistakenly think they have had a penetration test performed, or they think they haven't and they have, or they think that something is going to be bigger than it really is, or they think it's going to be smaller than it really is. And all of those kind of confusions can just make it harder for businesses to navigate this space of cybersecurity as it relates to the field of penetration testing. And so we thought it'd be really valuable to bring in some experts, our partners in the field that we use to do penetration testing for our customers, and to introduce you to them and to let them explain to you kind of what a penetration test is and isn't, what the scope of it is, and why you may want one for your business, and where the value of penetration testing can be for your organization. Before we go any further, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which is our partner today is another MSP. And obviously that's a bit unique for us to bring in what is arguably in some ways a competitor, but by no means is Convergence really a direct competitor to Paragus. First of all, they're on the other side of the country. Second of all, we leverage them when it comes to doing the types of security services like penetration testing that we don't have the in-house expertise to be able to do effectively. But also with some of these situations, it's nice to have an independent third-party non-biased perspective when it comes to something like analyzing your IT, especially if you're wholly dependent on your managed service provider to do your IT for you. So it's a little bit of kind of letting somebody else come in and analyze how good a job we're doing for our customers, and to have that third-party perspective that is less biased than having us kind of monitor ourselves. So for all of those reasons, we love working with Convergence, and they have a very, very specialized team who has 10 plus years of experience working really exclusively in the security side of this space. So they're a much bigger company than Paragus is today, and one piece of that company is their focus on security or managed security services. And within that is their offering to do penetration testing. And so that's why we wanted to bring them in. They were also recently recognized as one of the top 250 managed service security providers in the country, which is quite impressive. And I think in a moment, you'll get a sense of just how good a company these guys are and why we feel comfortable trusting our client relationships to them. So I am going to introduce our speaker today, Raphael. Raphael is one of the security engineers at Convergence. He specifically is one of the team members who provides penetration testing and security consulting services. He himself has 8+ years of cybersecurity experience and has worked both in the commercial and the federal space. He's very literate at kind of the space between networking, cloud engineering, and security engineering, and has a lot of experience in both defensive but also offensive side of security, which he'll tell you a little bit more about. He holds at least 11 certifications. My guess is even more. And he's extremely passionate about all things cyber, which I think is going to come through in his presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand the table over to Raphael from Convergence Networks.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. So I appreciate everyone's time today. I have some folks on here to keep me in line if I start to bleed over and nerd out a little bit, which I do tend to do. But give me 1 second here. Let me go and get this shared over for you guys. Let's see. All right, so penetration testing. What is penetration testing? So often referred to as a pen test, and sometimes when you're feeling really excited, ethical hacking. So it's a term that's thrown around a lot, especially in movies. You see those guys hacking into the DoD through five seconds of coding, which is not real. It takes hours, takes a lot of skill, a lot of work to kind of get things done there. But it gets thrown around a lot when you kind of hear the hacking term. So penetration testing is an authorized simulated cyber attack used to evaluate the security of a system or resource within an organization. To put it in simpler terms, as ethical hackers, we look for and try to identify vulnerabilities within an organization, and we attempt to exploit them to help the company or organization understand the risk involved with those vulnerabilities. So another quick term for that, defense by offense. Now, to help understand penetration testing, I think it's also important to understand the difference between penetration testing and vulnerability scans. So vulnerability scan is an automated scan that provides a list of current vulnerabilities and categorizes them based on severity classification. So extremely important, something that companies should do on a periodic basis. It gives you a snapshot of vulnerabilities in real time at the time of the scan. Helps you kind of stay ahead of the game because patches, vulnerabilities are being released every single day. So it's important to get that done. Now, with that being said, penetration test is a combination of both manual and automated testing, which finds and attempts to exploit vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So this provides a more in-depth look at potential risks associated with each vulnerability. So when you're looking at a penetration test, there are what we call attack chains or pathways, and vulnerabilities can be chained together to an ultimate goal of gaining access to financial data, sensitive data, PII. And with a vulnerability scan, it kind of gives you a look of, yes, these vulnerabilities exist, but what happens from there, right? So penetration test kind of opens the curtain and shows you this vulnerability is in fact a huge risk to the organization. Now, a good example of that would be a vulnerability scan identifying various vulnerabilities on one machine, critical, medium, high, lows, so different ones here and there. So when you look at a vulnerability scan in that from that perspective, the obvious choice is to make sure that the IT, the team is prioritizing those critical vulnerabilities and trickling down to high, medium, low, right? But during a pen test, let's say they identified those exact same vulnerabilities, critical, medium, highs, and lows. When they exploit those vulnerabilities, maybe one gives remote access to that machine with non-critical data hosted on it, but that same machine has a medium vulnerability that leads to, let's say, administrator credentials, which can be used to take over the domain later on. So then during the report, which we'll discuss later, this kind of gives the team a direction, right? Maybe we don't focus on the critical vulnerability, but we look at the medium first because that's the one that we don't want to happen. And hopefully that makes sense. Now, preparing for a pen test can be pretty stressful. There's a lot of things that kind of go in and out during a pen test and beforehand. So the first thing we point out is having a general understanding of your network and your IT systems. So that's not to say that you have to know every IP address of every server in your system, where they're located, but you have to know, yes, we have financial servers. Yes, we have database servers in our network. Yes, we have Active Directory, right? Or maybe we're using Azure AD or a hybrid cloud environment. And the reason why you want to understand what kind of network you have, what kind of systems are running in place, is they can get overlooked, right? So we know that we have a bunch of database servers on-prem, but we forgot about the QuickBooks server that handles all our financial data that's in the cloud, which is connected through VPN. So now we do a scoping and we say we want to target these because they're so important, but then we forget about the financial data that's being hosted in the cloud. And, obviously having an MSP helps with that, and they bridge the gap there, and you can kind of consult with them in understanding what should or should not be tested. Now, second thing is making sure that the appropriate parties are notified. So this kind of falls in line with the authority that's approving the penetration test. But obviously, generally, the SOC, if you have one, security team, if you have one, they generally would like to be notified. And we recommend that mainly because when we do these penetration tests, alarms will generally be set off. And what we want to avoid is the security team kind of chasing their tail, figuring out what's going on when really it could just be a quick, that's that guy, Raphael. He's just kind of knocking around things. So we want to make sure the appropriate people are notified. Also, to make sure I don't go to jail for breaking into anything. That all comes into place when you do these our pen test authorization forms to make sure the organization agrees with what we're doing, and we don't step out of bounds when we do the penetration test. And then lastly, I think extremely important is identifying your objectives, right? So obviously the primary goal of a penetration test is to understand your current cybersecurity posture, but also improve your security. But there may be goals in hand, right? Maybe it's compliance with certifications. Maybe it's compliance in order to gain some kind of cybersecurity insurance, or maybe your team is doing awesome, and they just want you to want to validate that your team is doing what they say they're doing. Or you want to make sure that your most secure data, your most sensitive data is actually secure. So identifying your objectives beforehand is kind of good to speak about, especially when we do our kickoff call, because it helps us focus on what really matters for you guys. And please just kind of take a step back. Please do not be this person. So during a penetration test beforehand, we do a scope of work and we try to understand what's going to be tested. And it's very common for organizations to shield the more vulnerable parts of their network. And maybe the reason is because they know it's old and they know it's going to be exploitable, but they don't want to include it because it's a waste of time. But then you're kind of missing the bigger picture of all this, which is what happens during a compromise, right? Maybe it's a 2008 server, which, believe it or not, that still hangs around in the balance. It's end of life, but it's still out there in the wild. And they're easy exploitable, right? So if you try to leave that out of the scope, good. You know, you're not going to get hit on your report. But let's say we were able to exploit that machine because it was in scope. And then we're also able to use that to scrape, let's say, historical data that maybe wasn't used anymore, but just happened to have that password list that was being used by IT. Or maybe it's just a scheme that IT likes to use, right? They love to use organization name 123 exclamation point. So then from that, I can deduce that maybe clients are using their client name with 123 exclamation point. So you want to be selective with what you're doing a penetration test against, but you don't want to just hide all those vulnerabilities just for the sake of having a nice report, because you're doing yourself a disservice by excluding those vulnerabilities. So with penetration testing, there are various types and they all focus on different objectives. And we'll kind of hit both or hit all of them and kind of give examples to make sure we're all kind of have a good picture of what they do. So an external penetration test evaluates the security of an organization's external facing systems and infrastructure. So this type of testing focuses on identifying vulnerabilities and weaknesses that can be exploited by malicious hackers or cyber criminals from outside the organization. So the goal here is, does your organization have weaknesses that can be accessed from the internet? And can we use those weaknesses to gain access to the internal network? And then from there, kind of a free zone, right? So just to kind of give you an illustration of that, right? So from penetration tester's perspective, we're not in the network, we're outside. So anything on the outside is essentially anything anyone can reach, right? So web server, your firewall, your cloud network, if it's exposed, we look at that attack surface and we try to find vulnerabilities there and see if we can gain access or use that to take advantage of other resources. So an example of that would be an exposed web server with no MFA configured, weak password policies, which is a good recipe for a brute force attack. So in this example, brute forcing that web server and gaining valid credentials can be used to gain access to, let's say, the VPN. And let's say that password shared, right, through single sign-on. So now we gain access to your internal network because of weak password policies and weak configurations within that public facing web server. So on the flip side, internal penetration testing evaluates the security of an organization's internal network system and infrastructure. And this type of testing focuses on identifying vulnerabilities and weaknesses that can be exploited by individuals with insider access to the organization's network, such as employees, contractors, authorized users. So this kind of takes the look of perspective of an assumed breach. So yes, you want to know what your weaknesses are on the outside, but you need to understand what happens when they get into your network. Maybe they get into your network and they can't do anything from there because your EDR is just crazy and kicks them right out the network. They can't do anything, or maybe not, right? So the penetrate we take the perspective inside the network. We have access to everything that anyone in the company would have normally, and we try to find vulnerabilities and identify them and try to exploit them and see what depth of damage can be done from that point of view. So a good example there would be, so we're already on the network. We find that there's a physical security controller that's unpatched and has an exploit available for it. So as a pen tester, we'll use that exploit to gain remote access to that machine. And this example is a live one that's happened in the past. With access to that controller, we can start assigning codes for smart cards or pins to get into the office. We can actually just unlock the door past 9 o'clock p.m. So we kind of get free reign from that, right? All from an unpatched controller within the network. So it kind of shows the extent of kind of risk involved with that. So wireless penetration testing is pretty quick and short. So as a wireless pen test, we assess the security of a wireless network and all the aspects of the network's infrastructure with the wireless portion. Primary goal of this is to test and identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the wireless networks that can be exploited by unauthorized individuals or attackers attempting to gain access to the network. So I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna hope no one's ever using WEP or WPS, that little push button on the router to gain quick access to the wireless network. Using poor security protocols when it comes to wireless security is a big no-no and an easy exploitable function. And when you're looking at that, it's kind of similar to an external pen test, right? So we're still outside the network. We have no access to the internal portion, but we're trying to gain access from the outside just through different security technologies. So in this case, your wireless router access points. So an example of that would be a poorly configured client or access point. And being within range of that access point, we're able to crack the pin. And in this case, I don't think I specified it, but let's for the sake of this say WPS. So WPS is a very old technology and can be cracked pretty quickly to gain the pin and pre-shared key with the wireless network. So from that point, we can crack the pin, gain access to the wireless network, and now we're in the network. So that one is pretty short and simple. Now, web application penetration testing is a little more complicated. So this aims at identifying vulnerabilities and security weaknesses in a web application. This type of testing focuses on the application layer of an organization's technology stack, with the primary goal of discovering potential security flaws that could be exploited by malicious hackers. So this one actually gets mixed up with external pen testing a lot because most web applications are external facing. Yes, we still look at it like an external pen test as well. We try to find vulnerabilities that are public facing, but we take a deeper look at the web application itself. How is it handling requests and posts through the network, right? So when you're logging in or you're posting a comment on a website, where are those requests going, right? They get posted to the server itself and maybe to the backend database, or maybe they're pulling from the backend database. But what happens with insecure protocols is, or insecure practices, is those requests can be intercepted. Maybe they can be modified in transit, and then we, let's say, can use that to gain access to a web page that's only accessible to admins. So this one is a little more interesting in the sense that we go a little above and beyond just just standard vulnerabilities and exploits. We're looking at what is your web application actually doing, and we try to understand that workflow and use that workflow to our advantage, which attackers could do as well. So an example of that would be a client has hired outside developers to create a web application. So due to insecure coding practices, we're able to identify multiple SQL injection vulnerabilities, which allowed us to dump the entire database, which contained PII, in some cases PHI, which and even login information for some of those users. So SQL is a very well-known vulnerability when it comes to web application pen testing. And it is a very good indicator on not indicator, but it can lead to very dangerous results, such as web shells gaining access to the server itself, running command injection, or like in this example, just dumping the entire database. So something you definitely want to key on, especially when you're building your own custom web apps. We wouldn't consider it web app pen test if you're using vendor supplied products. But if you have your own developers and you're developing your own products and software, definitely recommend doing these because they get overlooked very much. Social engineering pen testing, probably the most exciting one, my favorite to do personally. So this focuses on assessing an organization's vulnerability to social engineering attacks. So unlike traditional penetration tests, this primarily targets which technically targets vulnerabilities with IT systems. Social engineering targets the human psychology and behavior to gain unauthorized access to information systems or physical premises. So when we're talking about social engineering, obviously the most common is through phishing, right? Sending an email to a user, gaining access to credentials, or even more and worse, gaining remote access to their machine. So when you're looking at a social engineering pen test, this can include phishing, which is voice calling, text messaging. Depending on if we're on site, maybe coming up to the door itself and asking employees, how do you guys operate? What do you guys do for a living? What kind of systems do you guys use in your network, right? And then using that to take advantage of the network overall. So an example of that would be a client, which most clients or organizations will have job postings on their website, which is fair. So to take advantage of that, and I say this because I don't use this in play anymore, otherwise I wouldn't be spilling the secrets here. Clients or organizations like to post job postings, and what I used to do was use that to take advantage of the HR department. So I create an awesome resume for that specific role, which just as a side note, I have probably 9 or 10 LinkedIn accounts for every role you could think of. And what I do is I'll apply to those, kind of gain some rapport and trust with whoever is in charge of kind of vetting out these potential prospects. And once they're kind of in line with that, send an updated resume or documentation they need on their end with malicious malware embedded into that. And that malware will usually be a remote access Trojan. So gain access to their machine from there. Can I gain access to other people in the department? And it's been successful, but we're kind of toning down on that because it is pretty tough to deliver malware through email, just because Microsoft has been pretty prevalent in the security side of making sure those get blocked off. But this just kind of gives a taste of social engineering at its best in time when I was doing them. So physical penetration testing, kind of a mix of social engineering. So this focuses on evaluating the effectiveness of an organization's physical security measures, controls, and procedures. So unlike traditional penetration tests, this primarily targets digital systems and networks, or that primarily targets digital systems and networks. Physical security penetration tests assess the security of an organization's physical premises, assets, and personnel. So kind of in line with social engineering, can I dress up as a FedEx delivery person and follow behind an individual and piggyback into the office, right? So this illustration right here is just obviously not walking right through the front door that easy, but what's at your front door? Do you have a lobby with a security personnel? Do you have someone that identifies people as they come into the office? Maybe they have badges that need to be identified or PIN access. So this kind of gives a general flow of getting in through the front door, getting access to someone's computer, getting access to the network from that point on. So kind of with the example I was elaborating to earlier. An organization uses badge access to gain access to the building, but does not have any front desk personnel to make sure that those are being followed. So let's say we're able to disguise ourselves as an arbitrary vendor. Maybe it's FedEx, maybe it's pizza delivery, maybe it's a vendor we've observed that is often used to deliver your products. So if we're able to, let's say, trick the person letting people in, or people kind of as we walk into the building, they don't even badge an eye at us because we're dressed appropriately. So with the help of overly trusting employees, we pig it back into the office. And then what we do in that scenario, we try to gain access to systems. And the easiest way is to plug in a malicious USB into a machine, which no one ever looks at those. They leave them in the office, they just plug it in, walk away, and you'll never know it's there. And those devices can either be a remote call to my machine that's out in the public internet, or probably a little bit easier to perform is key logging, right? Just leave it in there for the day, let you guys log in and out of systems, and then at the end of the day, just plug it back out, plug it in my machine, and just kind of parse through those keystrokes and see what you guys have been logging into. Hopefully not fun, not the interesting stuff that you guys wouldn't want people to see, but more the business systems, but things happen in those senses. So that's physical pen testing in a wrap. So with penetration testing, the process and timelines involved, generally we start with a kickoff. We'll spend a 30-minute to 1 hour meeting with the organization or client, and we'll determine the goals, what your network consists of, what we want to test, what we don't want to test, and we make sure everyone on both sides is on the same page. And we really do this to make sure that we have an understanding of what we really need to test and the limitations and repercussions of testing certain systems, or what we shouldn't touch. So once we get the kickoff out the way, we'll start the penetration test, which is generally anywhere between 1 to 3 weeks. It really just depends on the size of the network or the scope that we're testing. And then what we like to do is a debrief meeting. So a lot of providers, when they do a pen test, they'll hand the report off and kind of say, great working with you, and take it from there. We like to do a debrief and kind of touch on the high level of what we found, and just to make sure that the non-technical folks are able to understand what they're going to parse through. Now, with that being said, pen test reports have a high level portion for the C exec suite, managers and directors that could care less about the technical stuff, but just more about what do we need to focus on. But there's a technical aspect that can be anywhere between 20 to 100 pages long. I think my longest report was probably about 104 pages long. And believe me, they're fun to read. So if you have a chance to read them, please do. But don't, if you like to enjoy your mind, maybe kind of take them in bites. Don't read it all at once. I don't recommend that. So after the debrief meeting, we do offer retesting. So we give the organization a chance to patch those vulnerabilities, mitigate or remediate those findings, and then we'll retest those exact vulnerabilities to make sure they're not valid anymore. And this just kind of gives you a peace of mind in understanding that, yes, we had holes, but who cares? We're clear now, right? It's better the good guys find these vulnerabilities than the bad guys. So we like to retest to make sure that one, our findings were valid, and that two, you're better off at the end of this whole project. And then once everyone's satisfied with the report, satisfied with the retesting, we close the project out. Wish you guys luck on your next venture, and hope that we're able to help you guys out in the future. So process is very straightforward. I try to make it as simple as possible. We try to make sure that there's no sweat involved in this pen test, but there will be sometimes, depending on where you're at maturity wise in your systems. But with that being said, I'll shut up there. I'll let you guys kind of have some room for questions there, and I'll pass it off to Delcy before we kind of dive into that.
That's great. Thank you, Raphael. That was very helpful. I'll
Absolutely.
kind of moderate some of the questions from the chat. The first is, somebody said that they've heard of white box and gray box and black box. Could you help us understand the difference between what those terms mean?
Absolutely. So when you're talking about a black box penetration test, we look at the organization's network and IT systems resources. We look at it with no information at all. So let's say a client comes up to us and say, we want to do a black box penetration test. Really, the only details is the organization's name and kind of rules of engagement, right? What to do, what not to do. We don't get any information on what your public URLs, your public IP addresses, what's inside, what's the networks, what's the subnet that you guys have associated. And we try to give the most adversarial, realistic emulation that we can, and identifying what an attacker would come with no information at hand. So the benefit there is you get to, again, see the realistic view of an attacker from the outside. But there's disadvantages with that as well, right? So systems may get overlooked. So you don't get the whole picture of your whole network or your vulnerabilities, your cybersecurity posture. But again, it's kind of a kind of give and take. Which do you prefer? What can really happen, or what is all the potential damage that can happen? So when it comes to a gray box, let me start with a white box. A white box is everything is given up front. This is our organization. This is our subnet. This is our list of local networks within our network. This is our public side. This is where you can find them. And we attempt to find vulnerabilities and exploit everything we can against those systems. So those generally take a little bit longer, but it's the most benefit there is that you're getting a real look of everything you guys own and making sure that we're testing everything so nothing gets missed there. So the most common one, which is a gray box, is probably the most. I think that's a good mix of both. So we'll get the organization's name. We'll know kind of the network inside. We'll know what the public facing side looks like, but we won't know the technology that's associated with those, right? With a white box, they'll tell you we use Cisco Meraki firewalls, or we have MySQL databases being used, right? That kind of gives an attacker, or it gives us as a pen tester a direction of how to approach and attack that machine. With a gray box, you'll give us those locations, what the IP address is, how to kind of approach that, but with limited information. So we have to do some enumeration when we find that public facing server that yes, they're using MySQL, or maybe they're using Microsoft SQL, or maybe their internal network is using AD, but they're also using hybrid. We didn't know that, but we found that during our enumeration phase. So that would be the kind of a quick description of all three.
And Raphael, could you give us, I'm sure it varies on the situation, the circumstance, but a ballpark of what a client might expect to pay for a penetration test, like even just what the range is?
So a general range within that. So let's just look at it from like a small business standard network, maybe one or two, a public facing website, some wireless routers. So we'd be looking at anywhere between I say 6 to 12K. And then what we like to do there when we look at those numbers is when we do the scoping, we start to just determine, well, this is a little too high. Maybe we can trim down these servers. Maybe we could test these next year on the when we budget appropriately for that. Or maybe we have a lot of room. Let's start adding in more systems that we didn't want to test originally. So just kind of give and take there. We can kind of play around with those numbers to kind of meet everyone in the middle.
How often is it that you do one of these penetration tests and you aren't able to find any, you're not able to kind of get through the defenses and get into the network? Like, how often are clients successful keeping you guys out?
So hey, pulling at my pride here. So when we're talking about external pen testing, it's pretty common not to gain access to the internal side. And to be honest there, that's kind of the goal, right? When you're looking at external, your external attack surface, most of your security is going to be focused on that, right? Because everyone knows you don't want anyone to gain access to your network. So that's usually pretty secure. Now, with that being said, there are clients that have external facing systems that just have security misconfigurations or weaknesses, and we can gain access to that and then kind of pivot to the internal network. But I would say from the external side, it's usually less common to gain access. The internal is where the fun really starts. So the internal side, you think, okay, that's just vulnerabilities. They're going to exploit it. They're going to gain access to this server. But when you start talking about attack chains, that's where the fun comes in, right? So we gain access to one server, which is seemingly not that important, but then we use that to scrape credentials, or maybe more common is hashes. Those hashes, if you're not using a strong password policy, we're able to put into a cracking machine and crack that password. Then we use that to map out weaknesses within your Active Directory. And lo and behold, there's almost always a path from a domain admin user to the domain admins group, which essentially means domain takeover. So I had to throw that in there so it doesn't sound too weak, but yeah, when you're talking external though, it is it's much more common to not breach those defenses.
And somebody's asking, are you guys starting to leverage any AI like deep fakes or voice impersonations, things like that in some of your social engineering attacks? Is that something you can tell us a little bit about, kind of how you guys are looking at that?
Absolutely. So I've actually started incorporating AI. I think 2 or 3 months ago now. I was a little late to the game, and mainly because I'm a paranoid guy and I like to make sure everything is vetted out before I kind of start throwing things into the mix. But some of the examples I've used it for is, I'll start off by saying I'm not a programmer. Hate looking at code, although I do it every day. I use AI to develop multiple organizational websites, and I use that in social engineering, right? So, one of the most common ones I do are financial institutions, or if we do a pen test for another MSP, is I'll have a medical facility with its whole built website all in AI. And I've used AI to generate a couple of to help generate a couple of malicious software that we can use and embed in those websites. And I've used that as a kind of a platform to kind of bounce off into, okay, this is a trusted looking website. Everything's legit about the homepage, but as you're traversing through the website, you just scroll through the wrong path, and then boom, we gain access to your browser. And that's a legitimate method that I do use in social engineering. Other things I've done with AI is doing a lot of scripting to allow me to do these pen tests a little bit faster and be more efficient. But I have not used them for deepfakes or any vishing. That has been on my mind among 50,000 other things related to using AI for other fun stuff. So we'll definitely get there.
And maybe kind of just an obvious question, what who should be doing penetration testing? How big should your business be? What industry do you need to be in? Like, if I'm a small business owner or I work in a small business, how do I know whether my business needs a penetration test?
Honestly, so, and this is not biased at all. I think every business should do a penetration test. Now, what that scope involves obviously depends on the business size and what you guys can afford, right? But I think everyone benefits from a penetration test because really you're not, if you look at it from the perspective that you're being proactive in finding these security vulnerabilities, and you're making sure that someone from the outside doesn't exploit that themselves. You think about the cost of doing a penetration test versus a cybersecurity incident, ransomware, which is thousands to millions of dollars, not to mention your company's reputation. So I think there's always room for every organization to do that, if possible, at least, yeah, kind of chunks here and there.
I love this question. Somebody's asking, from your perspective as somebody who knows a lot about cybersecurity and sees a lot of threats, what are some of the newest kinds of threats you're seeing that really scare you or concern you that you think are going to have an impact on the small businesses?
Yeah, so I'll mention probably the most common one that I'm using now, which is fairly new this year. So um, there's a very well-known Microsoft Teams bug. They're not calling it a vulnerability, and they're not giving it a classification, but it's a bug that allows an attacker to manipulate the headers as they send a message to a target, and it doesn't parse through the message and identify malware or malicious links sent via Teams. So you can see how damaging that is, because a lot of most organizations I know use Microsoft Teams, and using that platform, I completely bypass email at this point because the spam filters are just honestly too strong sometimes. Using Microsoft Teams, I can target the entire company and deliver malware to everybody within probably 5 minutes. And that's something that was released and Microsoft has addressed by saying, we'll get to it when we can, because it's not that big of a vulnerability. Other things are exploits are released for vulnerabilities, usually long after they're already patched, but you'd be extremely surprised how much those are still present in patched systems, and we'll still use them and try to test them against systems, give remote access, dump data from those systems. So a lot of things are changing, and as a person in cybersecurity, you can ask my team. I do threat intel every morning before I start my job, and I do this one, to stay in the know, and then two, to take advantage of those exploits and use them in my attacks. Good question.
I'm just sorting through the notes here. How, for an organization that has done a penetration test, is it something you repeat every year? Is it every 5 years? Like, what's the right frequency for conducting a penetration test?
So at the minimum, I would say at least once a year. Now that cadence, whether it's every 3 months, twice a year, or specific systems throughout the year, that really is going to depend on your reason for doing a pen test, right? Maybe if it's compliance driven, some will say at least once a year. They'll call out at least one external pen test, not the rest. So you can kind of play with those options. But really, it all comes down to what your need is, right? But I would always recommend, and I'm sure my team would agree, at least once a year.
I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. Is anybody on that wants to unmute and ask any additional questions? I'll ask kind of one of my favorite questions, Raphael. Just what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about?
Oh gosh, thousands of things. I'm a dad, so those things worry me all the time. But in the cybersecurity world is finding a good balance between defense and offense, right? I want to take advantage of every vulnerability I can, but I also want to understand how those things work and how to help clients or organizations defend against those. So, and this is not a joke, and not I'm not just saying this for this webinar. You asked my wife. I'm doing threat intel when I have nothing better to do. I'll go on and see what's being released. What is Microsoft saying their vulnerabilities are today? What's Cisco saying they're having trouble controlling? And I think about these when I have nothing better to do, which is a lot of time. A lot of my free time is spent that way. So it does keep me up at night. I do look these things up as I'm laying in bed, just trying to go to sleep when I can't sleep. I just kind of think about these things. What can I do to increase my chances of breaking in? What can I do to help companies defend against these? So that keeps me up a lot.
Well, we all appreciate the passion that you bring to this, because it helps keep us safe. It helps keep our clients safe, and somebody's got to be worrying about these things so that the rest of us don't have to think about them, and we can just worry about the robot overlords taking over the planet. If there's no other questions, we can wrap up. Any final thoughts from anybody before we let Raphael and his team go? Terrific. Well, I really want to thank you, Raphael, for your time today, and the rest of the Convergent Network team. I know there's a few others on the call. This has been very helpful and very informative, and I really appreciate you guys putting in the time and the effort to share this information with us.
And thank you, Raphael. This was awesome.
Absolutely. Appreciate everyone's time, giving me a platform to nerd out. So thank you.
Well done.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.